Annemarie, thank you for joining us. First, I want to ask you to tell us about you, what you and the organization do, and how you got here. What's your journey like?
Oh, Johan, how much time do you have?
We can spend a lot of time. Let's see.
I'll give you the elevated version, or let me try to give you the elevated version. And I always start with saying I'm an occupational therapist, and I say that with so much pride because I think we really understand, discover, look, and focus on people in a very pragmatic, holistic, but practical way. So I've obviously been a clinical therapist for a long time. I've worked across the world. I've done a lot of work in the UK. I've also practiced in Los Angeles, in California, in sensory integration, using a lot of, and predominantly, I think 90% of my caseload at that time was on the autistic spectrum. But so I was traditionally wrapped up in clinical practice and then spent 3 years in the States, in the US, traveling. My husband and I moved 26 times in 3 years. It was brilliant. And then came back, and then I had itchy feet. I just couldn't find my feet back again. I was a little bit bored with clinical practice. I was working with a phenomenal Spanish woman who's quite on the forefront of the whole sensory processing research in California. But I came back and I was just, I was like halfway in the States, halfway here. My husband and I was 9 months away from each other. My first child was born. To say the least, my life and my brain, I think, was scattered and all over the place. And I didn't feel like I was belonging anywhere. I had a serious loss of belonging. And then I did move into clinical practice, and then there was actually quite a spiritual journey and a very personal journey where I worked through a coach who was more like a spiritual guide, and that led me on the fact that there was something in my life that I needed to explore further and that I needed to actually tap into. I was really bored in clinical practice. At the same time, I was asked to do training for the Occupational Therapy Association in South Africa because of the work that I've been exposed to, particularly in California. And obviously when I started to do training, I was like, the light bulb got switched on for me. I'm like, yes, I'm loving this. This is where I need to be. And I think traditionally as a therapist, I always worked with the child, but also with the family, with the mother, with the parents. So I've always had a very much holistic approach in we can never just work in isolation. We always have to expand on the family, the social structures. Where's this child going to school? Where's this person working, to make sure that we encapsulate all of that. And then sensory intelligence was born literally in my head in 2000. In 2002, we coined the name. I think I started my first business cards. We don't do business cards anymore. And I was part-time then working with parents and children, helping them to understand themselves, helping them to understand their children. How could they actually maximize their learning, their home environment? What are your sensory triggers that your child have? What do you look out for? How do you manage those behaviors? So that was my introduction journey into the sensory intelligence space. So it started with parenting workshop. And then parenting workshop, we did a lot of teacher training, and then we moved into the corporate space. If we had a work team that was working together, how can sensory intelligence help them in understanding themselves, each other? How are we more productive? Where's our stresses? What in our environment is overloading? So I think then it kind of just roll it off from there. And then I wrote my book when did I write my book? 2007, 2005. Before that, I started with my PhD, which started off as a master's. And I was wanting to test. Remember at that stage when I started this, Johan, no one was looking at sensory processing for adults. So I was looking at adults and adolescents. How do we understand an adult brain or an adolescent brain through those frameworks that I've been using with children? And then my research was in a call center. I went into a call center and I said, okay, this is a crazy environment. People are sitting there on top of each other. It sounds like a beehive. So it's very noisy, very smelly, very visually overloading. How in the world can people make high-level calls there? So that's why I did my PhD. And I said, if you are more sensory sensitive, if you have low thresholds, there's no way that you can work in a call center. Voila, I've proven my hypothesis, obviously. And I think after that, that's just how sensory intelligence further emerged. So the focus that we have now is I have designed sensory assessments and products that people can measure their own threshold, and anyone can do that online. And then we do train the trainer or train the practitioner or train the therapist or train the coach or train the psychologist. So we actually also then train other people to use our methodology. And then, we partner with a lot of people who are interested in using sensory processing, whether it is for corporate or workspace or wellness or productivity, neurodiversity. The workplace design space also is very prominent in that. And then we obviously also deliver this in training, coaching, assessment services for corporate clients. That's a quick overview now. Was it quick enough?
No, it was. So, look, I think it's such a misunderstood topic. What are probably, or when you experience, your biggest hurdles when you speak to a new client, a new corporate? Do they think it's mumbo jumbo? Yeah. Do they understand it? What's that process to land that consulting or advisory deal?
Yeah. And I do think for a long time, people were saying, Annemarie, you're ahead of your time. And I think I have been ahead of my time for a long time, but it has changed. I do think it's changing. And I can't say many reasons why. I think the post-COVID era, we were forced to look at people in a different way. I think so. I think there's a few factors that I think make it easier for a corporate decision maker to understand why this is important. Firstly, I think it's, talent and talent retention. We need to get the best people in to work for an organization, and then we need to keep them there. I love the younger generation, because the younger generation, different things matter for them. It's not how much money are you going to pay me and how much job stability can I have. I love the younger generation's wild and out of the box thinking according to our frameworks, because they are a lot more around, I want flexible working, I want to have more autonomy, you need to develop me. So I think the demands that the younger generation is making on the workforce is brilliant. I totally support that. And what I'm really happy about this whole mental health, I kind of want to call it wave of disarray and of difficulty, is also contributing to the fact that, people are struggling. And I think just in the South African context, on top of all of our political and our economical climate, the world is struggling across the board. So mental health and well-being is being recognized as something that is important to consider. And I mean, we know, according to, and I'll send you that link, mental health and well-being and associated costs is going to cost the world economy $6 trillion by 2030. $6 trillion by 2030. That's how many years have we got? We've got 6 years, and then we're there. So, I mean, the other great thing, and this is where we will possibly talk about, I think neurodiversity as being a lot more aware has also brought organizations more to the forefront of having a recognition for this. And I think there's more to be talking about that, but we'll come back to that. So I do think traditionally it's been hard for me to land, the work that we, for instance, do in understanding the sensory intelligence piece with a corporate client. But it's all about how you make people better. How do you make them be more productive? How do you keep them at work for longer? How do you improve their productivity? How do you improve their reduced absenteeism? And how do you keep them there? And how are people cohesively just communicating, working together? And if people, if they use that on their scorecard and they look at those as a KPI, then it's a no-brainer. Then how can you not invest in that from an employee point of view?
And even in all this AI work that I'm doing, I keep on coming back to the value of humans and the things AI can't do, replacing experience, intuition, that person to person, that touch on the shoulder. Are you okay? That, I think, which is a result of our evolution. You can't AI that away. We want to belong. We want to feel safe.
Yeah.
And my vested interest in this topic is obviously, as you know, I've only, a year and a half maybe ago, discovered that I'm on the spectrum myself, which made my whole past life, especially my childhood, make absolute sense. I was very conflicted about it, how I was dealt with stimulation, especially auditory stimulation, and also in the relationship I am now to help my partner understand, and also for my son. And I can already in my son start seeing little elements of neurodiversity. Probably not, I don't know, but I can see it. But, by what I've seen in this tech space and in this AI space and the articles I've read, it seems like a lot of people, or perhaps maybe not a lot, but more than in other areas, who work in tech and digitalization and AI are potentially on the spectrum. And I read a few reports about like Silicon Valley being possibly the biggest concentration of autistic or spectrum people. And why I think it's important is because most organizations are becoming technological organizations. Whether they're a bank or a telco or insurance company, they're essentially being run by tech. So the percentage of staff members who are technologists are increasing rapidly. And I don't think there's enough awareness or even skills to accommodate these people who are very probably to some extent on the spectrum. So that's my assumption, Annemarie. So is it right or is it wrong? And maybe what can you comment on that?
I can't wait to comment on that. But before I comment on that, I just want to loop a little bit back to your previous comment around AI and humans. I kind of want to say, Johan, and it's so interesting we are having this conversation, because if I have to put a continuum from the one end and totally the opposite end, I think AI is on the one end and sensory intelligence is on the other end, for sure. Because I think what we are trying to do is just rekindle humanity. And humanity is all, how do I see? How do I hear? How do I smell? How does my body move? How do I touch? All of your senses is what makes us human. And I just want to highlight that. I love AI, by the way. Whatever we can do to make life easier, I'm on it. I'm a very much a tech lover, and my team hates me because whenever there's something new, like, can we use it? How can we use it? So I absolutely love it. But I do think the world needs to have great clarity on understanding that if we don't focus on develop the human side, people are not going to be able to think creatively. We're not going to be able to problem solve. We're not going to be able for analytical thinking. I'm definitely finding that technology has made people so lazy to think. And I think my biggest bugbear is like, people don't think for themselves. They're so reliant. They become a little bit robotic, if I can say it that way. So I think that's the danger, and AI is going to make our lives so much easier, without a doubt, but we have to maintain humanity and what makes us truly, truly human, because those are the skills of the future. Those people are the high-level people that are going to get hired, that's going to get the high-level jobs, because they've got that capacity to think differently, to think creatively, to think analytically. And then if you can feed that back into that human an element of, are you okay? Showing emotion, showing compassion. That's absolutely brilliant. So very important. So I had to say that first. And then I want to take you on your Silicon Valley thing. I'm going to share my journey with you, which will be a fascinating one. And this is maybe where my age is counting as an advantage here. I'm not that old, by the way. So just make sure you tell your audience I'm not that old. But I have got a few years under my belt. When I worked in the States, when I left to go work in California in the States, was 1997. At that stage, I was in clinical practice for, I think, 7 years. I haven't worked with one single autistic child. I haven't seen autism was not on the map. It wasn't there. So I moved to the States. I did some other work. And then the last year when I was working in California, 90% of the caseload that I was working with was on the autistic spectrum. And I remember, and I was clueless. I didn't know what to do. So I remember being thrown into working with, and it was not necessarily children just on the spectrum. It was children with classic autism, which was really low functioning. So it was a totally new world to me. And at that stage, I had these discussions with the the practice owners, I was working in a clinical practice, and I'm like, well, we don't have any autism in South Africa. And they said, wait, you are going to get them. And obviously, only after I came back did it suddenly start to surface. So autism now has been escalating. It wasn't there before. And autism was birthed in Silicon Valley. Yes, it was birthed in Silicon Valley. The first autism was picked up in Silicon Valley. But if you now think about it, so that's very interesting, and I don't want to go too much into detail because I obviously have no research or data necessarily to back that up. But I think if you go dig deep, Johan, you will definitely find that there will be some research coming up from that side, because it was definitely born in California. The rise or the initial or the prevalence of autism when I was working in the States was definitely Californian based, and I mean that is Silicon Valley. Now it's interesting. Two things that you might find interesting, which we worked on a lot at that stage. Both Steve Jobs and Microsoft Bill Gates, neither of them allowed their children to use digital devices when they were younger. Okay, neither of them did. You can go check that. That I've read that. So Steve Jobs and Bill Gates did not allow their children to go onto digital devices because we know there's a little bit of, you get addicted to it. So that's a different story, and I worked a lot in that space trying to help parents to understand how do you find a balance in technology. However, technology is an absolute godsend for someone who's on the spectrum. Why? Because if you work with technology, you are focused in a digital stream. It doesn't talk back to you. You don't need to have social skills. You don't need to listen carefully for the nuances, what they are talking about. You don't need to think, how are you going to socially engage with a computer or with technology? Technology it's still stimulating, it's very, very interesting, but it totally removes the component that autism is really struggling with. Which then means they can use their superpower, because, by the way, let's just face it and make sure you use this word, and please quote me on this word. People on the spectrum has got superpowers. They really have got superpowers, but in the wrong job context and in the wrong environment, those superpowers actually becomes, a problem for them, because they're not being understood, they're not being utilized, and they're not being, I think they don't necessarily get the credit that they deserve, because people on the spectrum think differently. They have got very different ways that their brains are wired, and the tech space allow them to maximize and to use those superpowers that they have. And working with a machine is different to working with a human, because humans are messy. They're not white or black or white, they're gray. You never know what's going on. There's so many nuances if you engage with people as opposed to engaging with tech. Tech is zeros and ones, and there's a process to it, and I can get to the bottom of it, and I can understand. I'm making it very simplified now, but that's the difference. So whenever I've worked with someone on the autism spectrum, I would always promote them to go into a tech space, because they flourish in tech spaces by default, because their superpowers are being used for what they're really, really good at.
Wow. And it resonates with me, because I remember even as a young child, or maybe an early teenager, my dad got us a computer. It was one of those yellow screens, 20 megabyte. I mean, today my son laughs if he hears what we used back then. But I remember I always struggled socially. People kind of irritated me, especially the culture I grew up in, voortrekkers and all this stuff. All I wanted to do is sit in front of a computer, and I taught myself to program, and I wrote a few systems for my dad's company. I loved it. And it's that idea almost of pattern seekers. Like for some reason, and that's maybe why the tech resonates with me. And it's a safe space, like you say, Annemarie. And it probably doesn't apply to 100% of people, but I think many people are drawn to that. Probably we can bring in engineering as well, maybe. But it's almost like a lone wolf career where you flourish, But I've also, over the last few months, read a lot of articles very anti this conversation. saying it's almost a bit of a fashionable thing these days to say you're on the spectrum, and every man and his dog is saying that, which probably is true. But it kind of plays against that yearning for understanding with others, because they think you just, like for instance, a friend of mine would say, I'm also irritated by loud noises. And I said, of course that's true, but my brain gets irritated a lot quicker than your brain for reasons like that. And which then brings me to this question: how do people know whether they or a loved one or a colleague are probably on the spectrum? And I know the spectrum is a great word because it's wide. What are some of the telltale signs?
Johan, and I think it's a very important conversation that we need to have, and I want you to really write about that, because I'm a therapist, and in my life, how do we determine if someone is on the spectrum, and if they are on the spectrum, how do we help them? So what has happened, it's become a fad, or this label. So, and everyone seems to want to attach a label to themselves. I'm on the spectrum, I've got ADHD, I'm OCD, I've got anxiety disorder, I've got depression. At the one end, I'm so glad, because these things used to be such, what's the word now? It was like, you're not allowed to mention that. These were labels that was hush-hush. No one wanted to talk about that. So the pendulum has swung to the other side. I'm really happy that people are talking about it, that it's more acknowledged, that people are more open to divulge this about themselves, because I think to their benefit, rightfully, as you said, it's opened up a whole new world for you. But unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people who are not on the spectrum, who are not ADHD, who does not have an anxiety or a depressive disorder, but that want the label, heaven knows why. And then what they do, I think they cloud this space so much that the people who really are on the spectrum and are ADHD and do have that particular diagnosis are not getting the help that they deserve. And then I think decision makers, we don't want to go there, because now suddenly we have to accommodate everyone in my business. If I've got a business and now 80% of the people in my business say, well, I'm on the spectrum and you need to do X, Y, and Z, I wouldn't want to, that's a can of worms that I also wouldn't want to go to. So I think that's the danger here, that we need to be very careful on what does autism spectrum means, and I'm using autism spectrum, but for that matter, any of the other diagnostic differentials. What does it mean? Are you on the spectrum? How much is it impacting your life? I mean, if you do have the formal diagnosis, then yes, let's help you to make your life easier, because it's life-changing. A diagnosis for someone who's truly on the spectrum is life-changing, because suddenly your world makes sense. Now you understand yourself, and it's like you can give one big sigh of relief, and suddenly you can just live your life in a very different framework, and that's a gift. But I think we are missing it because of, everyone is on the spectrum. People have said, oh, you are ADHD. No, I'm not ADHD. I'm not on the spectrum. But some people would like to say I'm ADHD. No, I'm not ADHD. I'm a sensory seeker. My brain is very busy. I have to be stimulated, and I'm always 5 steps ahead of everyone else. Does it mean I get distracted quickly? Absolutely. Does it mean I have to put things in place to manage my focus, my attention? Absolutely. But no, I'm not on the ADHD spectrum, because, that means something totally different. So I think that labeling is verging on being totally misused and abused, actually, if I can say it from that point of view.
We went from an era of total ignorance to over-focus on it, which is almost worse. How would, if people listen to this or read the article on Annemarie, and if they think they might be on the spectrum, and I mean, it's, again, I always say to people, it's not like you can draw my blood and test it and for a fact know I'm on the spectrum. It's probably more, around the behavior and other signposts. So if you can maybe tell me, what are some of the signs, although it's probably very broad, but also, where do you go if you think you're on the spectrum? Is the psychologist, is it the GP, and how do they work? Because it's, again, not blood. It's a list they go through.
Yeah, it is a list that they go through. Look, so I'm going to start, there's a few answers to that. I always, and when I do train a lot of other practitioners, and I always say there's 3 factors to make you search different avenues. So one is the problems that you are experiencing. Are they intense? Are they frequent? And are they impacting your daily function? So that's the key thing here. Because some of us might have some quirky habits or quirky ideas, but it doesn't happen a lot. But it's not really that serious and it's not really impacting my life. Then, you know what? You're just one of those people that want to add the label to it, but it's not real. So the key thing is intensity, frequency, function. You can't be one day a little bit on the spectrum and tomorrow you're not. It doesn't work like that. So, so it's frequent. It happens all the time. Intensity means that's exactly what you were referring to, Johan. Your noise sensitivity is much more amplified than someone else with a noise sensitivity, because that's a typical pattern that we find in the autism spectrum world. The sensory sensitivities are seriously amplified and it really is impacting them quite a lot. Okay, so that's the intensity. And then it must make certain stuff harder for you. It doesn't mean you can't function, but you have to make adaptations in order to function. And if we can use you as an example, I remember you shared this with me. You still go and you do talks. But if you finish with a talk, you remove yourself from the environment. You don't linger around to actually engage. And so it doesn't mean you can't do what you need to do, but you need to adapt how you do it in order to be the best version of yourself. So I think that's the important thing. So remember, intensity, frequency, function. Then the other thing is it does need a formal diagnosis. The GPs are not going to be able to do that. They are not the people to do it. Traditionally, and remember, I haven't sent anyone for a diagnosis. I can definitely follow up with some of my resources, but it's typically a neurologist or a psychiatrist, or not even a psychologist. Some of the psychologists can, but it is typically a diagnosis. A formal diagnosis needs to be done by a medical practitioner. And medical practitioners would be neurologists or psychiatrists. If we really now pinpoint it right down. Psychologists, for instance, we are not allowed to diagnose. We are an allied health profession, but we are not allowed to diagnose a particular disorder or anything for anyone. Neither should a psychologist or neither should someone else. It's usually contextualized within the medical frameworks. But the GPs are too general. They don't work. This is a very specialized area, so they wouldn't be the right people to do it, and they will possibly not be able to do that for you. So it is typically your neurologist and your psychiatrist. But I know there are neurodiversity clinics, there are neurodiversity centers, which are often run by health professions groups. So it's a whole group of, whether it's a psychiatrist or a psychologist, there's often occupational therapists involved or whoever is involved with that. So they can then, and they often work with medical practitioners in that context that can help you to get diagnosed. Please don't ask Dr. Google.
Yeah. Yes.
Please do not ask Dr. Google, Dr. ChatGPT. Neither Dr. ChatGPT and neither Dr. Google is equipped enough to do that.
You're right.
Use them to learn more about it. Use them to understand it, and use them to maybe have maybe I am on the spectrum, or maybe this is something for me that I might need to explore. But don't decide you're on the spectrum, or don't self-diagnose. Okay, so that's the thing. Please, for heaven's sake, don't self-diagnose, because you're not equipped to do that. It is a highly, highly skilled, very particular process that one needs to go through in order to get the diagnosis. But what I thought I could do, I just downloaded a little bit of a thing on the autism spectrum. I can share it just with you so that you know what are the typical things that we see in autism. And there's many versions to it, but it's important to look at it. The top two there is social communication and social interaction and social imagination. We do know people on the autistic spectrum are always a little bit socially awkward, or socially they don't necessarily fit in. They don't necessarily always catch, say, I'm just pulling your leg. It's like, they don't necessarily They don't read abstract in those social languages as well. I'm using a bit of an extreme example, but they don't read social cues that well, and they don't exhibit social cues that well either. So the social component is quite important. Then they can have repetitive behavior and a little bit of OCD, because repetitive behavior, and we call it in autism, we also call it tics. It could be tics or it could be repetitive behaviors. Those are actually self-regulation methodology. So what is happening, the autistic person is using that in order to self-calm, to self-regulate, to self-soothe. So they've got a purpose for the person on the ASD spectrum. It's often inappropriate, or it's often increases social awkwardness, but it is as a matter to self-regulate. The sensory processing in your typical ASD person is usually quite disruptive. So their worlds are often very overwhelming, very disjointed. They don't experience the world as a lot of other people do. So they feel weird and awkward based on the sensory stimulus responses are awkward because they experience sensation very differently. They don't like routine and change, because routine and change, which is so fascinating, and I've worked with this so long in my life, routine and change, any transition, if you go, even for us going into this meeting and out of this meeting as a transition, it might be minor, but it's still a transition. If you need to go from this meeting, get into your car maybe and drive somewhere, that's a transition. A transition is even getting shower in the morning and putting your clothes on. Any transition changes, any minor little change that happens throughout the day is often quite difficult for people on the autism spectrum. They like to maintain particular order and particular routines because it's not disrupting their nervous system. Okay, so that's typical what we find. And there's restricted and intense interest. They can super focus. And that's where their superpower comes in. They read between the lines. They see things, hear things, experience things that other people don't. And that gives them that bit of repetitive. They would go repetitive, but that's where their superpower comes to play. So having the capacity to just see things that other people don't, working with patterns and data, and then they kind of over-focus on that. So that's really what happens. There's the sensory processing differences. It's very known. I think last time I've checked the data, Johan, it's something like 95% of people on the ASD spectrum struggle with their sensory processing. The world feels weird to them. It's either overloading, it's too bright, it's too noisy, it's too smelly, you're too much in my space. So that's why their environment and where they work and where they function and operate is really, truly important to them. And then there's the executive functioning that comes in. It's just your cortical thinking. They could get stuck on certain behavior patterns, but I think it also plays into their superpowers. So that's a little bit of an overview. What are the typical things that we find? So, and then when we look at this in the younger person, it's often also around language. So it's social, but it's also language. And that's why people on the ASD spectrum love to work with tech, because you don't need to use language, or you don't need to use very fancy language. You don't need to engage a lot of verbally. So if we look at language and social interaction, verbally as well as nonverbal, are typically the stuff that people on the spectrum struggle with. Does that make sense?
It does. And I've just been smiling inside as you were talking, Annemarie, because for me, obviously the sensory overload is a problem, but routine. I'll eat the same thing every day in the morning at the same time. And I can adapt a bit, but like if my fiance suddenly says, no, we're going to do this and not that, it feels like I'm struggling, like I'm treading water. I feel totally out of my space. And that also happens in corporate, where the routine is suddenly disrupted, There's two key things I want to ask you before we end. The one is a twofold question, Annemarie. I read that the gender difference on the spectrum is more males and females 3-1 or something like that. So my first question is that true, and why, even if we know? And then I've also read that there has been a massive increase in autism, but it could be better diagnosis rather than anything else, or is it a lifestyle or something? So male and female split and potential increase. What
and the prevalence, yeah. Look, the male and the female split, if we take that back, and this is, I think, where my background really does help. If we look at child development, if we look like when children develop, boys develop slower than girls. They do catch up later on, but they are slower in their development, and those are genetically predisposed. They do catch up. But so, yes, there are definitely more of a prevalence in boys than there are in girls. So, yes, there's a higher prevalence in males than there are in females. Johan, I must admit, I haven't checked any of the latest research and stats. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to research, but I've been researching not necessarily in the autism space, but that seems to be the truth. But I would maybe just double check that, and maybe it might be worthwhile to just look at that research. It has been the tendency, even if we track it back to early onset of autism versus later on. I do think what is happening, and we see this definitely in both ADHD and autism, late onset diagnosis seems to be more occurring in females than in males. Okay, so that seems to be the truth, because it might be masked longer in females than in males, but I will still go double check that with some research, and it would be easy. I will just throw that into Google Scholar maybe. Okay, try Google, but I would even then try Google Scholar. There is definitely that. The prevalence, I think it's a combo of both things. I do think there's more awareness, which is brilliant. But I also think with that increased awareness comes overuse and over-labeling. That's definitely. And yes, I do think our lives have become more, I want to say, conducive to facilitate ASD or to actually contribute to that. If we just think about COVID, everyone was socially isolated. So I think the world is becoming more lonely. Loneliness is increasing across the world. So I do think a lot more people fly solo. Communities aren't as strong as they used to be. And an ASD type of a profile is a bit of a lone wolf, and it is a bit of a loner. So that doesn't necessarily add to that. Whether all the chemicals that we get in and what's in the environment and what we eat and what we breathe in have an impact, it could be so. Again, I would check that with what is the updated research on what is the cause of autism. I do think there has been a lot of research around identifying certain brain genes and certain genetic predispositions for autism. That is definitely the case, but I think there's always emerging new data, so it would be important to look at that. But the prevalence, yes, I do think it's more. If I just track back my history, I started, there was nothing, and then it's definitely increased. And I think where we traditionally have seen an increase in the child population, I think now we are also seeing an increase in the adult population. So I think, embracing that as a label, embracing that as a diagnosis, where it's really relevant and true for an adult, I think is truly important. So I think it's a little bit of a combination of all those factors, if that would be my guess.
Just a follow-up question on this topic, because I'm, and she won't judge me for saying it, I have a partner who's now into menopause, and I probably will ask you wrong medical terminology way, but we call it early onset menopause, whatever that term is, or menopause. Does that have anything to do with late diagnosis of women? It's probably a stupid question. I'll take it out of the article.
Oh, Ron, I'm gonna tell your fiance, menopause is a shit show. I'm also have gone through it, so it is horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous. Can it facilitate? Look, we do know, if we think about, and that would be important to check with research. The hormones is terrible. For instance, what we do see, we sometimes do see people's sensory thresholds change when they are pregnant. So their thresholds change when they go into menopause. It definitely can change those radical biological factors and those biological processes within your body. That's definitely so. And we do know autism usually has a trigger. If we go back to the child population, we often would find these children were developed perfectly normal, and then there was a trigger that facilitated or kind of then brought out the autism. So just understanding and knowing autism from across the lifespan and from a younger age, it can definitely be triggered by a particular event, something like menopause. But I do think, coming up for menopause, because I'm sitting on the receiving end of that, I do think there's not a lot of acknowledgement and a support for menopause, because also just menopause for me was emotionally an absolute shit show, and I'm using that as a word, so obviously don't quote me on that one, but
it's the best way.
It is totally traumatic. And I thought when I developed menopause that I had anxiety or depression. So for me, that emotional trauma, it was emotionally traumatic, definitely emotionally traumatic. And then it's corrected with HRT. Thank heavens for HRT. So if your fiancé isn't on HRT, tell her to go on it straight away. It made my life. It's changed my life. Yet again, and this is where maybe, and I'm giving you the flip side to it, maybe the diagnosis is facilitated then wrongfully so. Maybe it isn't autism, or it isn't ADHD, or it isn't depression or anxiety. It's a hormonal imbalance, which mimics like it could be autism, mimics like it could be depression, or mimics like it could be ADHD. And that's a very grey area, Johan. Admittedly, it's a grey area, but I do think it's worthwhile getting into it, because when we have these life-changing events, which is, from a menopause point of view, hormonal, it's actually the hormones, and then it gets masked as something different. And I think that's the most challenging part of possibly this whole conversation that we are having. How do we determine whether it's truly autism, whether it's truly a biological, imbalance, and it's actually something else? Because then we need to get to the root of the problem to obviously deal with it the right possible way, because the solution or the effectiveness of the solution is going to depend on what is the origin, what is it really.
Oh, interesting. Last question. If I'm a corporate exec that either reads the article, listens to one of your talks or to this video or whatever, and they say, we have to get Annemarie and her team in to help us. So at least they've got the awareness. Great. Where do you typically start? What is that first meeting? Is there a proof of concept, for lack of a better term? Is there a survey?
Yeah.
Corporates?
Johan, what we usually do, and say for instance, I would love for a tech company. Say for instance, we would reach a tech company and they would say, I think I've got some. So depending how they come to us with, it's always for us identifying what are their problem and what is their need. So if they would come to me and say, we think we've got neurodiverse people in our staff complement and we are worried about and we want to accommodate them, I would be like, you are my best client ever. But then the ideal for us would be we would go in and we would first do assessments, and we don't assess to see if you're on the spectrum. Obviously, we would assess them and see on a sensory level where are they, and then we can help to accommodate them from a workspace point of view for performance and productivity. So we can slice and look just at that particular group of people, but the ideal is to take a whole team. Because say for instance you've got a team of 10 and 2 of them they think might be on the autism spectrum, then working with that whole team of 10 and then to actually demystify that. And when we use sensory intelligence as a framework, we are all somewhere. So then we kind of do say, all of us are somewhere on the spectrum of responses to the environment. Your person on the autism spectrum is always going to be significantly exemplified and amplified, but then this other person also struggle with it. So it really helps from teams to understand each other, to be more compassionate, to work together better. How should I communicate with that person in my team? Don't phone him or don't just bounce up onto his desk. Send him an email or send him a WhatsApp. So what is the mode of communication with this group of people? So with understanding and insight comes a huge amount of capacity to understand myself, to understand my team, communicate better, facilitate productivity elements much better, remove the right distractions. So it's got such a big component on direct productivity and direct team cohesion, keen communication, keen teamwork. And then obviously the secondary impact is health and well-being. People will be calmer. They will not be so anxious. They won't be so fearful. Work will be a happier place. Happy people produce better work. So that's normally how we would approach it. And I think the fact that we as an organization come from the health science profession, so we're very well equipped to work with these type of clients. So we do self-assessments, then we do group sessions, because we have to just get the team cohesion correctly. And then we would do one-to-one sessions with those neurodiverse groups. We will do one-to-one coaching with them. And the whole idea is to help them to fit into the workspace much better and to understand themselves and to maximize what they do on a day-to-day basis.